Another fork in the path for what computers could be is, I like to think of like rugged objects or things that children would attach like little Tamagotchi or these little toy, devices to their backpacks. There are devices that you could build that are all at once accessible, hyper durable, and just very playful or very fun to use. And I think that one interesting path for the way Urbit computers could be developed is to sort of open ourselves up to the experience of something that could be thrown around, and we wouldn't take it or make it as precious an object.
All right, everybody, what's going on? This is the Other Life Podcast. I am Justin Murphy. This episode is one in a whole series all about Urbit. Urbit is a whole new computing and networking paradigm that many of you know I've become very interested in recent months, really recent years, the past couple of years or so. I think Urbit is just way crazier and way cooler than most people realize. I think a lot of people are sleeping on Urbit and just don't really know about what's going on with it, what it is, and all the cool, badass people building Urbit, building things on Urbit, creating on Urbit. And so now the development of the technology is really picking up and moving faster. I decided that when the Urbit annual conference came to town in Austin this past October, that I would sit down with 10 different people all across the network, people who are building the technology, people who are creating on the network, and people just in this culture that still I think a lot of people don't know much about. So I can honestly say this was one of the most interesting experiences I ever had at any kind of conference, to be perfectly honest. I spoke with CEOs, I spoke with engineers, I spoke with e-girls from weird theory Twitter. Like, I'm not talking about Instagram chicks, I'm talking about like weird theory girls in the Other Life neck of the woods of the Twitterverse and the blogosphere. I talked with skitsed out writers and post everything podcasters, and very possibly I spoke even with an alien. I'm only half kidding. It was just wild, man. It was really, really wild. A really, really interesting set of characters you're about to meet over the next 10 episodes, and I'm just super pumped to bring this series out into the world. So real quick, before I forget, I do want to let you know, if you're interested in Urbit, it's now easier than ever to get onto the network. So I actually have a bunch of Urbit planets, aka Urbit ships, pretty much computers in the cloud, an individual computer in the cloud that can be yours. It also functions as your identity, and it's what you use to log onto the network and to use Urbit. So if you want to, I'll give you one. I have a bunch, and any listener of the show, I want to get you on Urbit. So you can just go to imperceptible.computer. I made a whole site just for this purpose. And yeah, drop your email and I will get you a planet, aka an Urbit ship. All right. Depending on whether you're listening to this now or 2 years from now, there may or may not be some kind of modest fee associated with it. Right now, I'm just giving them out for free. You don't need to have any coding or programming skills or experience whatsoever. It's very straightforward. I will give you your own planet and you'll be on the network playing around, talking to people in 5 minutes probably. Okay, that's imperceptible.computer. I will put a link in the show notes. And the final thing, real quick, and then we'll get on to the show. This whole series was a labor of love. It was my idea. No one paid me to do it. I did, however, find eventually sponsors so that it wasn't at all done at a loss. And I'm very grateful to those sponsors. So this episode in particular is sponsored by the Tlon Collective. Tlon is the name of the first collectively owned and managed Urbit star. It's a membership organization run on Urbit, of course, that's focused on fellowship, sustainability, and sovereignty. Tlon, it's a small group. It's a private group. They're not advertising because they want to build their membership massively or anything like that. It's a small private group, but they do have a public channel. So listeners of the podcast might want to go check out what they're up to, say hi to them. And, if you're interested in those values, as am I, then you might find the Tlon Collective interesting. And they're one of the earliest groups really kind of building community on Urbit. So shout out to them. Big thanks to the Tlon Collective for sponsoring this episode. And I will put a link in the show notes to the Tlon Collective. All right, that's all from me. Let me get out of the way and on to the show. All right, Ed, pleasure to meet you in person.
Nice to meet you as well.
You are
it's good to be here.
You're the very first victim we have in our little mobile podcast studio here.
It's going to be rad.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you, excited to talk with you. You are one of the lead designers at Tlon.
Yes.
So just for the audience, why don't you give us a little bit of background, like how long have you been working on Urbit?
Yeah.
And what have been the main contributions that you've made to the Urbit ecosystem?
Yeah, so I got started in 2019 formally as a full-time employee, although prior to that, I'd been doing some contracting work, just some non-interface related work. And before that, 2017 is around when I discovered the project. So that's a bit of my timeline there.
Okay. And what have you worked on mostly?
So the core contribution, I guess, would be the sort of environment that defines that first interface that one experiences when they boot up their Urbit. So we've been calling that landscape. Up until very recently with our latest update, landscape was effectively the group's product. But now we've separated groups out, which is kind of a Discord-like sort of deal. It's just for chatting with friends, with communities or whatever. And now landscape is this totalizing ecosystem that now allows for software installation. So now anyone can build their own thing and just build it on Urbit.
Right. So for people listening who maybe have never been on Urbit, basically when you boot up your Urbit and you log in, you see a kind of default screen. And now what that looks like is it's a grid of apps, basically.
Yes, exactly.
And this is new because only recently can people make their own software on Urbit and share it with each other. And so soon we expect to see that grid proliferate with new apps. There should be more and more squares over time, right? As people,
Yes,
is that what you expect?
Yeah. So, what we've released right now and what we'll be presenting come assembly proper on the 15th or so will be what is termed as the very first release of this thing. So it's still in a bit of a nascent state at the moment. Tlon itself will only be offering around 3 to 4 official applications, but the idea is that anyone who has been a developer on Urbit for a long time is able to port whatever work they were doing before and make that available come that date. So we should expect to see a fresh kind of outcrop of just, fun new things. I know that some people have been working on more playful applications, like setting a little kind of locket-like picture on your home screen to look at whenever you log in. Some people have developed games, so we're going to see a nice proliferation soon, I believe.
Right. So this is the hope and the excitement in Urbit right now is that with the arrival of software distribution, now soon, hopefully there's going to be way more to do on there. People can make their own software, share it, and hopefully that's going to lead to a kind of proliferation of building and interesting things that you can do with Urbit. Now, let's talk a little bit about the design, though, because that's your forte.
Yes.
And what's interesting to me about Urbit is that even the haters on Urbit will generally be like, yeah, but the design is dope. So that's kind of nice for you, I'm sure, to hear that,
definitely.
right? So I want to learn a little bit more about what went into the design. What are kind of the influences? What are some of the design ideas or principles that are kind of most important to you personally and that, manifest in the Urbit design system that even the haters appreciate?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say that maybe to start this conversation, just because it is helpful, it's worth distinguishing that there is a bit of an existing sort of Tlon, certainly Urbit related as well, design canon of sorts that was mainly brought through Galen, our CEO. He's an architect by trade and ended up doing software, much like I had previously been doing physical product design, and I'm now finding myself in software. So it's a bit of a fun background there. The design thinking and sort of approach that had gone into play before my arrival, when I think about, Urbit in 2017 or so, the way that I like to describe it to people in terms of my own approach is that when I remember encountering it for the very first time, it was as though I was walking up and encountering like a heavy brass cube or a little cube made out of tungsten, where when you pick it up with your hand, it's just dense, so heavy. And that was kind of the vibe I think that was transmitted, through just the pure interface of it. At that time, Urbit was only a command line. So you can imagine that there must have been some very deeply spiritual thing or something very core to Urbit at the time that you could almost see as being sort of the underlying design intent, is just to be this very dense, very solid feeling object, almost mechanical. I know that the one example that Galen likes to sort of procure for describing what Urbit should be like ideally is a Curda calculator, which is a very old style of calculator that uses basically like a series of gears to sort of calculate numbers. And it's characterized by being very simple mechanically, but also being very, very durable. The thing could survive being buried in dirt for many years. So at the heart of it, when I think about, what Urbit is as a sort of design system, it's something that does feel that or impart that somehow, which is when you think about software kind of broadly, like writ large, there's generally a sense that it's almost as though one is existing within ever-shifting sands, I don't know when the rug is going to be pulled out from underneath me. I don't know when, various websites or interfaces are going to change. Our hope is to build something that feels, very, very durable. It's the word that we use often. So that's kind of where I wanted to start, where you kind of have this idea that Urbit itself is this very durable thing that can seemingly last a while. When I came into play, let's say, into the process of designing interfaces at Tlon, one of the sort of critiques that I had as a sort of outside party at the time was that while I was able to sort of certainly feel the imparting of this density and this very deep spirit to the project, it goes without saying that almost everyone who I guess would be a detractor who hasn't really gotten deep into the system would say that, oh, what is this thing? This thing is crazy. This thing literally, doesn't make sense to exist. Like it shouldn't exist in a way. And a lot of this is because the thing is all at once like opaque as well. It's a little bit impenetrable in a way. And so when I started working on interfaces, one of the sort of mantras that I had at the time was to almost create something disarming in a way. Like that was kind of the core word for me, was to take this thing that was at all at once even a little bit scary to some people. Like, what is this system? What is this mysterious thing that exists? And I was trying to sort of bring into form this idea that Urbit could be a disarming thing. It could be something where it's almost like a warm handshake, where it's like, oh, I didn't know you were a nice person. So the idea was to just make this thing a little bit more friendly. You can see this sort of come to play in some of the latest designs that we've released, where we've previously had a very austere sort of black and white, very sort of sharp aesthetic, and now things have been softened out a little bit. And while we don't want to kind of lean fully into that, I think there's a lot of very valid critique to be made about, flat design and sort of the hyper corporate softening of these very, terrible structures that exist out there. We don't want to at all sort of incorporate that sort of language. We do want to sort of make the thing as friendly as like a pebble, something you could pick up and hold in your hand and feel good about it, So
Right, totally.
Yeah.
And so, what's up with the sigils? Where did that? Or is that how you even pronounce it? Sigil, or is it sigil?
It was
I don't know.
Sigil, yes. So,
it is sigil.
Yeah, so that was a project that came before my time. One of the other designers that I worked with, Gav, he's an amazing guy. He's a genius. He was him and Galen were paired together and basically developed the system all on their own. And so you all, and maybe this could be referenced later, but there was a blog post that went in about the sort of process that went into sigils. There were a lot of inputs into that, a lot of previous systems, both artistic and design-wise, that went into their own process. I wouldn't be the best person to speak about it because that was before my time.
Gotcha.
But from
for
what
people,
I do know, yes.
For people listening who have no idea what I'm talking about, just the identities on the Urbit network are distinguished by unique sigils, and these are procedurally generated, presumably because there's like billions, right?
Yes. There's a huge amount, yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was, I think, one of their main design challenges, was to take something that had such a large namespace in the billions and create, distinct identities that didn't overlap with one another and were relatively easy to pick apart from one another.
And a lot of brands today at least have kind of one bold color generally.
Yes.
So was the decision to go pure black and white, was this like a big deliberation? Was there debate over this, or what's the idea behind like super austere black and white only, no colors?
Yeah, so I think this is something that was probably directly imparted from Galen if we were to suss out the origins of it. But I do get the sense that in its part in being a kind of radically simple new take on what a computer could be, there was this idea that it would be good to treat the thing as a piece of paper, in a sense, as a design object. It's this system that could have others' spirits, others' personalities imparted into it, which goes into a lot of, I guess, what you could call the general way that we sort of have encouraged customization of the system, where this thing sort of ships to you in the state of being a vessel of sorts, almost like a glass cup. A sheet of paper is my go-to metaphor here. And it's up to you to sort of like, inscribe upon it, make it your own, that sort of thing.
Right, totally. So I know something that you're interested in when it comes to Urbit is thinking about the future of Urbit becoming hardware.
Yes.
I also think this is very exciting. I don't know anything about what's going on in this regard, but I mean, what I've always thought is I should be able to go to the store and buy like an Urbit computer,
Absolutely.
Right? It should just be a laptop, and it should be nice looking and functional, but it should have nothing on it other than Urbit. And also, it should cost like $500 instead of like $2,000 for a new MacBook with all this like bloatware on it, basically.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my like hardware Urbit futurism is like a $500 computer that's just really, really well made but simple.
Yes.
It only runs Urbit, and you open it up, and it's just like one computer that will last for 100 years or something like that if you don't drop it. So what do you think about when it comes to the future of Urbit and hardware? What does that look like to you?
Oh, I mean, my hope is that it's beautiful. It's leagues above what is currently offered on the market now. Kind of tailing that back to sort of what is interesting in terms of Urbit physicality to me is that there's given the sort of state of Urbit being an open project, we're already beginning to see that there are people in the community who are experimenting with building their own enclosures over existing platforms like the Raspberry Pi system. There are people who are even researching and sort of mapping out what it would take to build a NOC running CPU, which they're terming like an NPU, like a NOC PU, processing unit, I should say. So there are people kind of working both from the sort of like very innards of what a computer can be to the sort of more aesthetic and more kind of shell-oriented aspects of it, which I find insanely exciting from my perspective. To sort of get into my own personal take here, Tlon isn't working on hardware at the moment. My dream is to maybe eventually take us there. But, when I think about what hardware is and what computers could be, a funny mantra that I like to sort of like repeat, half in jest, half in seriousness, is that, computers are flowers. Again, this is just the disarming statement to be that computers don't have to be these little glass baubles that we put into our pockets. They don't have to be these clamshell, devices that we do most of our computing on. They could maybe someday take on something as light and as beautiful and as natural feeling as what a flower could be. To my own ends, when I think about what a great notion of a physical Urbit could be, one of my go-tos is just thinking about some of the origins of the project and its language and being a durable object. And I like to think of like stones, or kind of like, something that's been sitting in a river for a while that's worn away. In my mind, it would be, like you said, amazing to just purchase an Urbit from a store, plug it into a wall, and just have the thing, just work. That's kind of the dream here, is to build a system that doesn't even necessarily require the internet to use or to kind of operate or to log in and make an account on. You want a system where you can just kind of insert it into your life somehow and it just exists and you can kind of forget about it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, an interesting question is like, why don't we already have that, right? Because computers like don't need to be so expensive, right? I mean,
absolutely not. No.
I mean, why don't? I mean, I know you can get kind of cheap laptops or whatever, but they don't. No one really gets them. Mm-hmm. It's not that popular.
Yeah.
So like, what is the roadblock between us now and having that?
It's a really good question. I mean, that's something that I would not at all claim to know the one solution that will necessarily fix this. But, I do get the sense that when we look at sort of the state of computers these days, it's almost explicitly an angle to the selling of these devices that they are now luxury objects, effectively. When I look at any of the latest sort of top brand items, these things are positioned and sort of marketed and even imaged in a way that is akin to like a shiny watch or a piece of jewelry. And I should probably silence that.
Oh, that's cool. No worries.
But the thing is that, what is being sold are baubles in a way, like these little delicate sort of trinkets that one sort of adorns themselves with. When I think about, what another fork in the path for what computers could be is, I like to think of like rugged objects or things that, like children would attach like little Tamagotchi or these little toy, devices to their backpacks. When they're younger. It's like, there are devices that you could build that are all at once accessible, hyper durable, and just very playful or very fun to use. And I think that one interesting path for the way Urbit computers could be developed is to sort of take a path where we sort of open ourselves up to the experience of something that could be thrown around, and we wouldn't take it or make it as precious an object.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like, I almost wonder if you could, just for fun, like buy wholesale a bunch of cheap laptops, like from China or whatever, and just like load them with Urbit and nothing else.
Yeah.
And then like sell them on the secondary market for like...
I mean, to be frank, like there are people in the community who are doing this, not necessarily with laptops as the form factor, but I do know that I have been DMing people who I will be seeing here at Assembly who have been working on effectively taking Raspberry Pis, shoving Urbit in there, making it the first boot thing that you see, and enclosing it within some bit of hardware. Yeah. So people are already starting the work for us.
That's pretty cool. Like I would buy one of those. I think that'd be really cool. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing is that, there are a lot of projects out there that sort of claim to be kind of self-sovereign or very personal sort of servers. They almost all unabashedly use Raspberry Pi as a platform, wrap it up in a box and pretend, to sell the thing like that's kind of mind-blowing. This is new. This is your Bitcoin server or whatever. But in fact, it's just a bunch of, like web services that kind of run off the thing. And I feel that while there's a bit of sort of like there's a path there that we would need to tread as well for in sort of like these initial Urbit computers, I feel that given that Urbit is in fact this virtual system, this overlay, there's sort of a bit more of a reality to having Urbit running on one of these devices than someone claiming that one of these things is like a personal server that just kind of exists using the existing stack.
Right. So now that there's software distribution, maybe it would be interesting for the audience to hear about how you think about designing applications for Urbit. Like what are just some heuristics or some principles that come to mind for you when it comes to designing apps for the Urbit system?
Yeah, so the very particular take that Tlon is making with respect to the ecosystem is that the way that I've liked to term it is that we're almost providing digital basics in a way where you have, in life, when you're wearing garments, you have a t-shirt, you have a set of trousers, maybe some sneakers. There are these basic items that, you use day in and day out. In a very similar manner, when I think about what the ethos of Tlon software for Urbit is, in a similar manner, to basics in terms of garments, I think the idea is to basically provide very minimal is not the right word. I feel that imparts way too much baggage, but there's an approach here that could be taken to basically offer an archetypical version of what a chat could be, of what a DM software could be, maybe someday of what, a spreadsheet software or drawing software could be. I think when I think about any projects that Tlon would likely be investing a lot of time and effort into, it would be to make these digital basics just so solid as Urbit really should be as a system. The idea being that, to the point about, what are we trying to sort of impart into this work, when you think about the sort of Discords of the world or Slacks or all these other Silicon Valley projects, there's this idea to make these things fun. Let's make work fun. Let's make it playful. And what we're trying to do here is sort of like not kid ourselves here. We're building what is in fact like a very new system that is a little bit sort of scary and kind of like hard for people to understand. And rather than lean into the weirdness of this and build weird software ourselves, we want to, make software that actually provides that bridge of understanding. Or maybe I exist now in a Web 2 world, or whatever you want to call it, pre-Urbit, I should say, and then maybe bridging into Urbit should feel just as comfortable as you would expect. It isn't like a shocking new place.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And so the production of these Urbit basics, as you call them, things like some kind of word processor, some kind of spreadsheet. Do you think that this will be the responsibility of Tlon, or is this going to come from the community? Like, how should people think of, like, if you're an engineer out there listening to this, right?
Yes.
And you want to build, do you expect individuals and groups to emerge that are working on the Excel spreadsheets for Urbit? Is that going to come from the community, or is it going to come from Tlon?
I not only expect it, I actively encourage it. If I'm very active
from the community.
Oh, absolutely.
Because it sounded like you're naturally saying it as if it was like on the roadmap for Tlon to produce.
Yeah, well, so the idea is that we'll always be honing the tools that we have set forth so far. One sort of bit of historical insight into why we've gone on the path that we have with respect to the software we're delivering is that early on, maybe a little bit before 2020, we were still in the process of having all of our internal communications be spread out, via various messaging platforms and such. And one of these, one day, there was just this idea that, we're building this thing, why aren't we using it, And so we got everybody from Tlon into what we termed OS 1 at the time, and realized it was a mess. We really got to fix this thing in order for us to use it. And through that process of experiencing our own interfaces, we built out what is effectively, software as a thesis in a way as to how we would ourselves like to sort of organize ourselves or work with one another. So in a way, you can see that the current state of, what people encounter as the default set of Urbit software is informed by that path of Tlon itself thinking about how do we want to sort of get work done or sort of just do basic communications with one another. And, thinking about, whether we end up working on a word processor or a spreadsheet, it's not so much that this is something that we won't do. It's that we are honing ourselves really about how we ourselves would like to be doing our own work on Urbit itself.
Right. So with it becoming cheaper to get on the network, that will definitely be a boon to adoption. Yes. What else? Are there particular bottlenecks that you see are in the way that once we lift those, we should expect growth of the network, or what else is relevant to think about?
So the economic one that we just went over, I think, is sort of one of the big ones. It's one of the looming ones that I think everybody who's encountered Urbit, and even speculators and sort of detractors outside it, have all been aware that the economic one blocker is a significant one. The other sort of more mechanical roadblocks in place that are easily solved in the sense of just labor, but that just need to be done really, is just the general way that we handle the sort of bridging mechanism between the acquiring of an Urbit, which is still a sort of, it is based in Web3 effectively, using Ethereum. And so there's a lot of cruft that we basically have to paper over there or improve heavily on the front of Bridge, which for those of you who have used Urbit probably are well aware of. Bridge.urbit.org is basically the mechanism by which someone activates an Urbit, gets into the network, and et cetera. And basically there has been a very long running list of issues that we've all been aware of with that interface in particular, that we do have major updates in store, which hopefully should make it a little bit easier to use. But the idea is to overhaul that whole structure very soon, to basically make it such that getting into Urbit, getting a planet started could be something very, very smooth. Maybe on the order of just setting up, an account on like a SaaS product, like a Netflix. It should be as easy as just kind of getting in quickly. And there are ways to basically do this just in terms of the sheer sort of user experience of it, the design of it. But we have been basically wanting to wait for L2 to ship, this layer 2 economic situation or solution, and plug it into the redesign of these new interfaces to make all of that a lot easier. But my hunch is that, once we're able to improve Bridge to the point where maybe after acquiring an Urbit somehow, whether it's through an exchange or a friend or what have you, the idea is that you could maybe take this thing and just plug it into Bridge as a system and maybe get started right away with, an executable that could just boot up Urbit really easily locally. Or maybe you could plug into a hosting service or a variety of them. There are a lot of ways that we could just basically make that whole process a lot smoother.
Okay. Makes a lot of sense. Now, for people who have never been on Urbit and are just kind of listening to this and maybe they're fascinated and curious, like give us some examples of like what kinds of cool things have you found on Urbit, or important relationships that have developed, or just for you and your experience on the network interacting with other people.
Yes.
Like what are some of the most interesting or coolest things you've gotten from the network?
So I think the absolute number one most amazing interaction that I've had on Urbit was that as a design team, we're primarily working on interfaces, just the sort of like product design related aspects of the work that we do at Tlon. For a while, we've been wanting to sort of hire an artist, like a proper graphic designer, someone who could basically provide a lot of the sort of like world building illustrative elements of what Urbit could be. And, while I was sort of like in the process of seeking someone out, I met this person, just kind of like in the like outer internet, just kind of like, randomly, I just came across her work and shot off an email. I was like, hey, you're cool. Your work is sick. Do you want to help us out with this work? So time transpired and she found herself very quickly in Urbit. And so we've actually been doing our work fully just through text. The sort of mind-blowing element to this is that she actually is not English fluent. She does speak a little bit of English, but she's been basically doing all of her work. Like we haven't called one another. We've never videoed. It's all been through Urbit primarily. And so there's this crazy sort of like bridging of what you could say are like completely different languages, different cultural contexts that has happened, which actually has been enabling us to get really serious work done. And it's all been happening through Urbit. And she's actually set up a community all in Urbit that is effectively like a music sharing and sort of just kind of like a everybody share music, everybody listen to mixtapes sort of deal. And it's one of my favorite communities on the system right now.
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Is that a public group or private?
Yeah, no. So the website itself is at door.link. And I could rattle off the sort of Urbit endpoint of that, maybe in text or
yeah, I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, but it is public. Anyone can join it. It's just a very, very chill group. It's very fun.
That's really cool. Interesting. So, anything else? People, ideas, concepts that you've encountered only on Urbit?
Yeah. So one of the elements of Urbit that I find interesting is that a lot of the people who find themselves into the Urbit world are interested in this idea of world building. What does it take to build a world? There are people who are interested in sort of like the more fantastical sort of, literary or sort of science fiction elements of world building. But there are also people who take it very seriously and kind of take the act of what Urbit is as an exercise in building a new world effectively. Thus the phrase we like to rattle off on social media, New World Energy. It's kind of like the mantra here. And so, one of the sort of more interesting groups that I've been kind of involved in or trying to facilitate on my own end is this group that's effectively working to become effectively like a design workshop or a world building sort of design shop of sorts that could basically act as, maybe like a guild-like mechanism to get people gathered together, think about how to enact new mechanisms or think about Urbit in broader ways. It's not something I've discovered per se. I had to kind of manifest it out of nowhere, but I've been finding amazing people sort of like glomming onto the project and who find it fascinating. But I feel like, it's just a part of like the broader energy that I've seen in a lot of the other groups that I've witnessed on Urbit is that people are coming into the fore with just this really interesting sort of energy that's just huge. It's like, it's energy that I don't think you would necessarily encounter in a lot of other sort of like I guess like social gathering places on the internet. People here are interested in enacting very large, almost insane structures, like structures that, would seem ridiculous to people on the outside.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Someone told me that you have a design for an EBook reader on Urbit.
Oh, dude.
Do you want to, so pitch us on this, explain kind of the problem, why Urbit needs an EBook reader, and then like how you conceptualize this to be built on Urbit.
Okay, so we can reel it back a bit. I remember in the very first OS 1 release, I promised, I like swore on the air that we will build the most beautiful, the best reading software that the world has ever seen. I'm still holding myself to that personally. This sort of observation that I've made, being like someone who loves reading, someone who loves researching apart from my work, is just that any book management software, research, citation management software is terrible, absolutely terrible. It's there is no good solution. And one of my kind of core thoughts here, of like a thesis, I would say, is that you find that a lot of the cruft of these softwares is really because they centralize themselves around markets in a way. But markets in sort of like maybe a not so great interpretation of what a market could be, in the sense that when you look at Kindle, when you look at any ebook reader, iBook, whatever, they all kind of revolve around the very first thing that you pop into is like a place to buy books. And when I think about ideal reading software, what's at the center of my bookshelf at home is not a vending machine to buy more books. It is my books. And so when I think about what an idealized reading software could be, putting basically the structure of one's library sort of at the fore of it and allowing it to be sort of just as simple as a nice wooden bookshelf is core to the whole thing. Ensuring that the typography of the thing could be, pushed and pulled at will. I feel like, it sounds simple to say, it maybe even like naively so, but I do get the sense that there are very large elements of current reading systems that can be ripped out and replaced with something much more simple that I hope to someday build on Urbit.
So how does the business model logic map out then on Urbit? Like, why would Urbit not just over time replicate the same kind of app store, bad incentives kind of issues that you're describing?
Well, it's interesting because one of the sort of core mechanics of Urbit is, and this sounds very simple to people who do know Urbit, but for people who don't know of Urbit as a technical structure, the magic of Urbit is that everybody is running their server. Everybody is running their own computer, which you might take for granted or for a given. If you're on your laptop, you think that that's your computer. But the magic of Urbit is that when software is being used to connect with someone on Urbit, you are all running your own instance of that software. So in a very real way, when I'm running landscape, it is my landscape. I could do whatever to it. And as long as I keep the sort of core connections there, I can still communicate with anyone on the network. So I could go all out and win-amplify it, make it crazy, skeuomorphic, whatever, and it would still be able to function as expected. The magic of an Urbit eBook Reader is that because of the fact that everybody is their own server, my library is my library. A market can never be inserted into it if I basically don't allow it. Then there's a really interesting element to the fact that sharing a book is still what we would call like a P2P action. And so me sharing a book with you is like opening up a connection between literally the two of our servers. It's the two of our sort of mechanical structures that are now sharing in the resource that is there. And so I just get the sense that as that underlay mechanic, the fact that everybody is in fact running their own server and the software on top of it is what makes this, I guess, much more of a resilient structure and something that you wouldn't necessarily need to worry about arbitrary centralized markets kind of being imparted into. That being said, there's an additional element here which gets really cool, which is that if you are an author, we want to sort of obviously build out mechanisms that will allow you to get paid for the work that you do. And so due to the way that this is all working, we're hoping to build a mechanic known as like gating or like modifiers to arbitrary applications. We might be starting off with group channels, but the idea is that as an author, I could maybe enact something of like a payment gate on, a book, which is effectively like a node on my computer, on my Urbit. And maybe in order to attain that book, you have to pay it, a one-time fee. So there are ways to sort of like build markets that are more sort of person to person. But it's something that still needs to be worked out, I feel.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And actually, this is a really good example just to use as a test case for kind of unpacking some of the business logics. Because so I understand what you say about how when everyone has their own server, you have different incentives to, let's say, build an app that you own, you control.
Yeah.
But will there be the incentives like for someone like you or an individual or even a small group? It takes a lot of resources to build, let's say, an ebook reader, right? That's probably, I'm assuming that's like a lot of development time, a lot of hours. So the argument in favor of the app stores is because you can make a large amount of money in these big demand aggregators, you can therefore fund big operations. So realistically, the critique of this like vision would be, at what point is it going to be economically incentivized for someone like you to actually build a team and engineer an ebook reader on like a reasonable development schedule, right? Because your point is well taken, but if there's not an app store for you to sell it, like realistically, when and how are people actually going to build badass apps?
It's a really good question. I mean, it's one of the sort of core questions that we are still continually asking ourselves with the deployment of software distribution as a system. At the present moment, the system is so new, it's so nascent that we don't even really have any holds barred on applications that could, theoretically, just look at your Urbit, or do things with it. And so we're kind of in a bit of a stage where it's a Wild West sort of situation where, if you download software from Tlon, it's kind of implicit at this point that you've been trusting the Tlon as a company for a while, which is it's a good thing. And we want to ensure that trust can be maintained despite Urbit being a very sort of like decentralized system. And so when we think about, what it would take to sort of get people into the mix of actually developing economically viable software and funding it appropriately, there are still some things that we do intend on building to basically make it such that, one could build gates or payment gates around software and be able to sort of actually make money off of it. You might not get the same markets that you would expect with, Amazon, but the idea is that, you're finding a very core kind of excited base of people who would hopefully buy into the work that you're doing on Urbit. That being said, when I do think about just payments in general on Urbit, one of the sort of magical things about Urbit as a sort of totalizing structure is that it treats one's computer almost as though it's kind of like an actualized self, like in real space. If I, do something negative in real life, there are consequences. In a very real way, Urbit has sort of enacted itself to sort of act in a very similar manner where, there are systems put into place to effectively, censure or basically block planets from, performing actual packet sending between Urbits. There's always that's already been built in. But I also think that, payments with respect to Urbit is interesting because, when someone basically takes an application into their Urbit, it is theirs, like in a very literal sense. Like if I buy an object from a grocery store, that is now mine to like consume, rip apart, throw away and not even use, whatever. In a very similar manner, when one is imparted with the software on Urbit, at that moment, you can do whatever you want with it. And so, when you pay for software in Urbit, it's not as though, you're being sort of subjected to software that you don't actually have ownership over or can't do anything with. You would in fact own the thing that you have acquired. So the same logic could be applied to books, to texts, what have you.
So how long do you think it'll be until we start seeing in the software distribution, which is now available, like how long until someone pushes an app and they charge like, $5 for it or something? Is this like within 6 months? Is this within like more like 3 years or what?
No, I think this is something that we actually anticipate happening relatively soon. I think it's been acknowledged by a lot of people at Tlon and in the greater ecosystem that ensuring that, transactions can be made is actually a very core mechanic that we need to lean into soon.
And there's a built-in Bitcoin wallet now.
There is,
cool.
Yeah. So that has existed for a while. That was a really great project to just get that experiment just out in the world so people can see what that looked like on Urbit. I think some of the further out dreams of that were basically to figure out how to build integrations into landscapes so that maybe you could have a pay-gated community or a channel and what have you. So there are a lot of remaining mechanics that we have yet to suss out. I think that this is really just going to be the subject matter of much more heavy kind of SDK or API-like development on Tlon's side. Now that Grid exists, there's like a little bit of a less sort of pressure for having Tlon kind of be the orchestrator of what that core experience is like. And so what we can begin to lean into is like how to make search great or how to make it easy to implement notifications into your own applications. I feel like ensuring that, payment gating and such and sort of arbitrary applications can be opened up to one another is a very core part of that.
Okay, fascinating. So there are now startups that are being built on Urbit, which is very interesting.
It is, yes.
I know of at least one. I don't know of many. Actually, I guess two. But are there interesting developments going on right now that you know of that you're interested in or excited about or you could share anything about, A? And then the second part of that question, B, would be, what do you see as the low-hanging fruit for like the next app that should be built like tomorrow? Like, so if you're an engineer listening to this or maybe an investor listening to this, like, do you see an opportunity where it's like, this is ready to be made now, it's needed, it would be valuable, and it could actually start making money like now rather than later? Is there anything that comes to mind? So it's kind of a double-sided question.
Yeah, well, the very first question or addressing that, some of the more interesting outstarts or upstarts that I've noted in the system are Terrell, which I think is the big one. Basically, what I see is their primary aim is basically making payments on Urbit a lot easier. The work that they're doing alone is going to unlock a lot of possibility here, in my opinion, and I'm excited for what they're doing. The other sort of upstart here that isn't yet a company, but in my opinion should very, very much be one, is the sort of Nox CPU project, which is at the moment, I know it's a bit of an experiment. It's a bit of a side project of the person working on it, but I do get the sense that exploring the ways in which Urbit can increasingly become standalone, can rest upon metal and not have to worry about other systems interfering, I think is very core to Urbit's future in a lot of ways.
And how does that business model work though on the Nox CPU? Like, who are they going to be selling physical computers, or who's the customer?
Well, in a similar manner to how a lot of the work that NVIDIA or Intel or AMD are doing, in that they are sort of like the shoulders upon what a lot of the rest of the sort of internet and networking and computer economic infrastructure really rests upon these fundamental developments. And in a very similar sense, kind of relating back to the time of like Bell Labs being the sort of people who are sort of pioneering what it meant to perform telephone communications like across America and figure out, what are the sort of core things that need to be done in order to make that better. I think that in a similar manner, having a lot of fundamental developments basically arise within this new Urbit universe is very important to the future of the project. To that sort of end, there was another project that I actually had in mind that really literally just escaped me right now that I think was worth mentioning. Oh, yes, which is the project and the subject matter of moons. I unironically believe that one of the more important companies that will probably emerge in the coming years in the Urbit world or the Urbit universe is a company that focuses on moons exclusively as a use case. For those of you in the audience who are not aware of what moons are, when you think about this sort of hierarchy of Urbit sort of like node space, basically what constitutes the internet that is Urbit, moons are the 4 billion or so nodes that rest upon or underneath each planet, which are what most people use on Urbit to do day-to-day communications. And so when you think about a planet sort of roughly approximating, what a person is or a family or a small unit of people, moons are kind of like devices. The idea being that maybe one day I could run my Urbit, at my home in a nice little server that looks beautiful, and I can maybe deploy a moon to my phone or to my laptop. And so what moons could effectively represent is a network of devices. And when you begin to extrapolate this idea of what moons could represent, you're talking about people being able to run their own CDNs, like content delivery networks, where I don't have to worry about Cloudflare, that which could shut me off at any time. I could maybe deploy 12 moons to various servers across the world and build a personal CDN. And the idea is that if you could automate this, if you could automate, the creation or the sort of deployment of thousands of moons at once, you could begin to imagine, worlds of sensor networks arising. One of our engineers at Tlon has expertise in sort of like quantum computing, I think is his background, and has thought that, when you think about what moons could be, when you think about what a network of computation could represent, there are a lot of really interesting sort of experiments that could happen in that world. I think his use case that he likes to bring up as like a favorite is a farmer, having a sort of swarm of drones that are each running a moon that are themselves like sensing mechanisms that could, tell you how your land is doing and such. So in my opinion, moons are kind of like a little bit of a dark horse at the moment. They're kind of like this thing that nobody really pays attention to, but I could seriously imagine, companies arising out of what they represent.
That's fascinating. And who is that engineer?
That is Dr. Pop Roxy. We all call him Pop Rox. His Urbit name is Datnut Pollen. Like it's an amazing name.
Yeah, I got to talk to that guy because that sounds really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's crazy.
And I mean, what can you do moons right now? Like, can I put
you can absolutely use them right now.
And can I like make a network like for my friends and family?
Yeah,
like how?
Yeah. So
how do you do it?
Well, so right now this is all performed within the Urbit command line. If you're running a planet, the incantation that you would use is effectively just bar, which is that little vertical line on the keyboard, moon. And by doing that, you get a new name, which is a little bit longer than a normal Urbit planet name, and you get the key that could be used to boot it up on any device. So it's very simple. Mechanically, it does involve command line stuff. It's something that I wouldn't necessarily recommend to people who are like new to using computers and certainly to Urbit, but it does work, and it is mechanically simple to do. I think the issue with moons at the moment are all very trivial. They're all easy to overcome. It's just the fact of the matter that right now, moons don't automatically sync data with their root planet. So if I have 20 applications installed on my Urbit right now, if I boot up a moon, it won't be a perfect mirror there. I'll have to perform some additional computation to ensure that they're mirrored. And at the same time, though, so on the converse of this issue is the fact that if you were to, for example, deploy a handful of moons to your family for them to use, which you very well could, and in my opinion, in the future should do as like how you primarily use Urbit. Right now, you would effectively have full, read access over their computers for all intents and purposes. So, not the greatest for privacy.
No, I want that over all my family
members. If it's for your family, maybe.
I got to keep an eye on them.
Exactly. Maybe it's a good thing. It all depends, of course. But I do get the sense that one of the very sort of trivial issues to overcome with moons is just making their ability to sort of be set in appropriate ways that, could respect privacy, could not, could call back to the planet, could not. There are just some sort of like very core mechanisms that need to be explored there.
Yeah. Okay. Fascinating. Yeah. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about the creator economy and kind of the future patterns we expect to see on Urbit. I know it's something you've given some thought to.
Yeah.
I've seen some of your mock-ups for kind of token-gated communities.
Yes.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you see the near future of creators on Urbit and maybe from a design perspective in particular, since that's kind of your forte.
Yeah.
Like how do you think about designing that? How do you expect that to look visually and feel and function?
Yeah, so this kind of cuts to one of my core critiques about the sort of often used structures that do exist for creators or for people organizing communities, which is that when your software is, Discord, when it's, what is the one that I'm thinking of? I think it's actually like Patreon or Substack or any of these really, you're kind of at the behest of these things. And the way in which you sort of have to cobble them together as a creator, while that is kind of like the primary aim of a lot of work that a creator is doing is kind of cobbling together a universe, it's not the most friendly process. And I think that when I imagine what, creator-friendly ecosystems or interface ecosystems could be on Urbit, I'd like to think of a thing that just feels exponentially more pleasant to sort of cobble together, to build yourself. In the sense that maybe building a group that sort of has very certain characteristics that you want to sort of enact on it are as simple as just filling out a form instead of having to sort of like how do I figure out API keys and how to sync my Twitch to my Patreon or what have you. I think that there are much more elegant ways to handle this. And a sort of other side to this critique, I would suppose, is that I think one of the sort of core mechanisms that many DAOs or many other sort of Web3 friendly upstarts are sort of doing right now is to basically build bots that exist in Discord, where that feels rickety. It feels like really
definitely
just, it doesn't feel like very pleasant to use. It's like you're kind of like using rubber bands to sort of tie a bunch of straws together to make a house. It just doesn't feel very good. And one of my sort of ways that I really think we could very literally and kind of just bring to bear the issue here in terms of interface design is to make it such that rather than sort of feeling that you're piecing together discrete APIs through something that feels kind of flimsy like a robot or a bot, maybe we want to sort of treat the assemblage of a creator space as being more akin to like designing land, for example. Like in sort of, if you can imagine some of these games where it's like, oh, I'm able to set out farmland and maybe factories or something, it'd be really cool to basically take a creator space as a topography of sorts. And so right now in our groups product, it's very kind of archetypically similar to most other things that exist out there. You have channels and you have kind of a primary space for chatting in. And I think that in a very literal manner, one of my thoughts here as a sort of very simple sort of addressing of this is to make channel types be sort of the medium through which you enact some of these things or these ideas that you would be otherwise cobbling together. So that if I'm a creator, maybe I want to build a wallet and have that be surfaced so that everybody in the community can pool funds somehow. That could just be another channel type rather than a bot that you have to kind of query. If I want to have like a space that acts as a blog, we have notebooks right now which are okay, but they're not the best. That could be explored to be much more rich as an interface itself that rests within the group structure. So when I think about topography, making these things a little bit less flimsy to use, I think that maybe leaning into and evolving our ideas of what channels could be with respect to a singular group could be a way of thinking about it.
Right. Okay. So what you're basically saying is, because right now when you log into a group on Urbit, it's basically chats, collections of links, and notebooks. There are these kind of a small number of types of channels basically that allow for different types of data to be posted to the group. And what you're saying basically is that could be spun out into any number of different channels. Maybe you have one for video. Maybe you have one for it's an audio podcast feed that like an RSS feed you can kind of link into your phone or something like that.
Yeah, the idea really is it's simple. It's not very mind blowing, but it's to treat this as like a developable space. I can almost imagine maybe as an Urbit developer, there's one path where you could develop and build your own standalone applications. But if you wanted to maybe plug into existing Tlon works, what I'm hoping we can encourage soon is building effectively software development kits for groups themselves, where rather than publishing a bot or something that feels flimsy, I could literally build a channel type and maybe sell that channel type to other, creators. You could imagine like sort of markets of channels kind of emerging from this sort of structure.
Okay, that's fascinating because I think you're right to diagnose this problem that currently if you're a creator, it's like you have all these different tools, all these different sites, and you can kind of glue some of the APIs together using tools like Zapier, but it's a massive headache, and it's just clearly not, like clearly the ideal, the platonic form of all of this is you make shit, and then like people who fuck with it come to you and hang out around it. Like that's basically all this is trying to be is that's all it needs to do. That's the essence of it. And yet to do that, you have to manage all these different systems and glue them together in these awkward ways. And I mean, like Grant and I right now, we're building indiethinkers.org community, which is like a dedicated kind of private membership community for a specific type of person, specific types of things that we try to provide. But we need basically to run events. We need to be able to schedule people for those events when they sign up, when they sign up for things. We need to feed them live stream videos, sometimes recorded videos. We need like a library of stuff, sometimes a place to actually watch and chat live stuff. And it's like we are cobbling together all these different things, whereas what we actually need is so simple. It's like we have all these people in one place. They're a certain type of person. We want to build structures for them, and it shouldn't be that hard for us to either build them ourselves or maybe hire an engineer that can basically make this like custom system where all we need to do is say, okay, you're interested in this, come here. And then once you're there, there's all this stuff that we organize how we want, we connect it how we want. And it shouldn't be that like these 20 different tools we have to cobble together. And we're constantly like messaging these services and being like, hey, when are you planning to drop this feature? We really need like, email reminders for this thing. And we can't really do this thing on your tool until we have email reminders. But it's like, ideally, we're just governing one space that we control. And maybe we have one engineer who is adding the functionality all in one place like that. It's just obviously so superior, and that's where it needs to be.
That is the hope.
And I'm just kind of like, okay, how do we get there? But faster. Like how can we get there faster? Like I'm trying to figure out like when will it be economically viable for me to actually just like maybe could a creator make their kind of creator brand like a company, hire an engineer, like have an onboard engineer who like is an Urbit hacker who basically like just could someone come on board and make my Urbit group like so fire that I can basically sell access for like a good amount of money. Like Indie Thinkers we charge $450 a year. It's like not cheap because we provide a lot of shit and it's cool. So I feel like for $450, like our annual run rate is something like $40,000 at the moment. And not even mentioning the courses we do, which they generally make like $30,000 a piece. I feel like that's enough. It's not massive, but I feel like that's enough economic firepower to be like, we have an engineer. Let's make all of this stuff custom in the Urbit group. And for selling things at that price, I feel like I should be able to pay an engineer to be able to make all of this stuff custom in Urbit. Is that like, how close are we to that?
Well, so the good news here is that there are sort of social structures that exist that are currently residing within the Urbit Foundation. We do have the grant system, which is something that I feel like most people who are aware of Urbit are familiar with. That doesn't really cut to the core of what you're desiring here, though, which is like that direct injection of sort of capital or sort of just, some means of basically just organizing the work ASAP. The other news here that I think has yet to be fully announced, but maybe might be worth mentioning, is that there is a plan to sort of offer alternative systems or structures that sort of rest in parallel to grants, so that they aren't really oriented to the individual who is interested in hacking on Urbit, building a one-off thing, but actual sort of more deep, institutionally recognized entities who could actually maybe affect the development paths of some of the core systems put into place. So something to look forward to. I know that on our own roadmap, I mean, I'm not at all promising anything per se, but I do know that the discussion of expanding the capabilities of groups are sort of archetypical, community structure is to make it increasingly archetypical. And this isn't even necessarily from a design, like a visual design perspective. When we think about what Discord is, it's like a very opinionated, very branded piece of software. We kind of want to further dissipate, I think, the notion of what groups are, maybe even make it into, like I keep saying, much more of a sort of system of APIs in a way that, a group is just a list of ships and a list of services. Maybe it could be that simple, and we could make it a much more malleable space, which I think is sort of one of the end goals, I think, for what realizing groups is as a standalone application is currently.
Yeah, and I think people have to appreciate that when you know that you can retain all of this value in the long term, it kind of changes the economic calculations, right? So it's like, I don't necessarily want to hire an engineer right now to build some kind of web app, all custom, because the patterns for all of that are so changing and so volatile.
Yeah.
And so it wouldn't really make a lot of sense for me with my current operation. I don't really need engineering on the clear web. It doesn't make a lot of sense because I can do everything I want to do with no code tools. It is a mess and it's a headache, and it's kind of obviously messy and suboptimal, but it works. And so the incentives aren't there for me to hire an engineer right now.
Yes.
But if I'm building a company that is on a computer that is going to last forever, and all of the structures and the value that we create by the combination of the audience and the media but also the actual technology that kind of organizes the group.
Yes.
If I know that we can retain that as a company in this like forever computer, it basically makes it economically more sensible to invest in something like real engineering.
Yes.
So that's kind of like a benefit of Urbit. A lot of the critique will be like Urbit moves too slow or whatever, the things that kind of make it feel like not sensible to actually build on Urbit right now. But there is this counterpoint that you do get a longer horizon out of it. And when you can kind of project a payoff into the future longer, it does kind of enable more investment in a way.
Yeah, and then there's sort of the absolute base reality of the situation, which is that Urbit is its people. Urbit is its community. When you think about the roadmap of Discord, like you said, it's probably just a lot of like messaging and badgering, maybe some devs on Twitter is like the most leverage you have here. The thing about Urbit is that, from the moment you obtain one and get one running on, your computer locally on a Raspberry Pi, maybe it's hosted. But, the thing is, technically it's yours. The technical structure is under your ownership and can be sort of like self-enacted, self-built up. You could, dig yourself a hole and learn Hoon in, 10 years and maybe come out a genius engineer. But I think the idea here is that this thing is, it's malleable. It is a space and it is a technical thing that you can, in fact, right this moment, make your changes to if you'd like, which is interesting because, the roadmap for a lot of these other projects that cobble themselves together to build creator ecosystems, who knows, what their VC funding is or what their lifespan is going to be. Right now, that the thing is yours for as long as you want to run it. So
yeah,
it is a certainly different outlook in terms of time.
Yeah, definitely. It's also kind of interesting to think about the connection between what you said before about a network of sensors, basically. Moons could become a network of sensors.
Yes.
That basically goes in the direction of Internet of Things, basically.
Oh, yeah.
So it's actually interesting to connect that with the creator economy stuff because one thing you see as a creator is there's a real demand for kind of in-person stuff. People love meeting up in person. I think they just always are going to, even if more and more everything is kind of built and started on the internet.
Yeah.
There's always a trajectory towards people wanting to hang out in real life. And so there's an interesting way in which you could actually imagine the creator economy kind of group membership dynamic merging with the Internet of Things dynamic in a way.
That's wild. Yeah.
In a way, right? Because if everyone is on their own personal server and you have a group or a community that's digital, but you're also like in your home, maybe in your township, in your neighborhood, building out Internet of Things structures, there's a world in which, maybe if you live in Nebraska, but you're like a member of my community, right? When you come to visit Austin once a year when we have a conference or something, you like are going to be plugging in to my Internet of Things here, right?
Yes.
But like only you can get it. Only the Urbit addresses that are like approved within my group are going to be able to like plug into my physical Internet of Things
Absolutely,
network.
Yes.
And I think that these types of ideas and visions are just like dizzying.
It absolutely is. One of my hopes for this actual conference, which we have too much on our plate already, and it would have added a lot more. But my hope is that maybe by one of these conferences, we could actually deploy some sort of like an Urbit intranet over whatever city we end up going to next. Maybe it's Austin, maybe it's somewhere else, but it would be amazing to have effectively an overlay, conference over the existing topography of a city that exists via moons. There are some really interesting ideas here for basically deploying what is effectively like alternate universes or realities across space.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it definitely jives with, I think, the current kind of trajectory of like the American political culture, where like people just want to be in different worlds, I think, like
in a very real way. Yes.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, you look at one thing and it's completely fragmented. It's fractal. It depends on what vantage point you offer up. Everything is just, fractioned to different realities for sure.
Totally. Like, and people are kind of debating, is cancel culture going to keep going? What's going to happen to the culture wars? But it's like probably in the very long run, just the left and the right will have different internets, basically.
I mean, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And Urbit could be the rails, right? Right.
I mean, we'll have to see.
Is that crazy, or what makes you laugh?
No, I don't think it's that crazy. I mean, it's already we're beginning to see that people on Urbit are effectively sort of, the people who have, in a way sort of unplugged from the matrix, if you want to kind of lean into that overused metaphor. It's like, you have this sort of existing reality that is discourse, which, you can willingly eject yourself from if possible. I think it's one of the things I find refreshing about a lot of the community is that it's just people, I think, who just want to sort of like relate to one another as like other people, which is, it's nice, but it is another way of living. It's another sort of reality that is being occupied right now.
Totally. For now, that's what it is. But if you do imagine a world where Urbit gains mass adoption, then probably what I would expect to see is you would see kind of molar formations on Urbit. So like there would be one part of the network that is overwhelmingly kind of left-wing types of groups. One part and another part of the network that's overwhelmingly right-wing kinds of groups.
No, I can absolutely imagine that happening. And in fact, it's one of the sort of aspects of the system that is almost explicit in the sense that computing, because of sort of the way that it has been sort of put back into the hands of the person who is computing, it's you can turn off packets at will. It's very, very easy to do. Maybe even dangerously so. You could form a bubble immediately within Urbit and maybe be the better or the worse for it. So
right.
We'll have to see.
I think the Internet of Things stuff is particularly resonant with people because, this idea that almost all the computing you do currently is on essentially other people's computers. Like nothing on your laptop is yours, basically.
Yeah, very
it's like that simple. Like even the stuff you feel that's most precious to you, your family photos, your personal writings, literally none of it is yours. It doesn't belong to you.
Yes.
It's kind of hilarious when you think about it, but that is very abstract for people. It's like when you just think about your laptop and what's on it, not a lot of people get too worked up or feel too violated, but I find that the psychological response to the Internet of Things stuff is totally different.
Oh, yeah.
So like when when people think about how like their Amazon Alexa is listening to them, that feels it feels different. Like that freaks people out and worries them and scares them and just makes them feel gross in a way. Like my wife, for instance, she's like very against. She doesn't want to have a smart home. She doesn't want to have any of these things. And I'm like kind of nerdy. I'm into tech and shit. Like I kind of want like a home that's all rigged up. I want like Alexas here and things and like all different things in different corners, like with automations and shit set up. To me, that's like cool. But my wife is like doesn't want any of those things because she just finds it creepy, and rightfully so. So I actually think that's a really interesting kind of inroad for Urbit because if a guy like me can go to his wife and be like, no, look, we're gonna have this like super crazy automated like steampunk smart home where like you like push a button here and like a ball rolls down a train track and then like hits my computer on the other end and turns on a light or something like that. We're gonna set up this really cool automated thing, but guess what? It's completely autonomous. We own it. There's no way in or out, and we have complete control. It's just like me hacking on it or whatever. That is suddenly
it's magical.
It's magical, right? And it's got this kind of cool, romantic, kind of steampunk kind of like vibe to it, and at least the way that I think about it in design sense. And I think that's like a real wedge in a way that like owning your data on your computer, people have become kind of like desensitized to.
It's another edge to, I think, the idea of maybe moons being that sort of dark horse of what a new company could represent or be enacted through on Urbit, which is very Urbit specific, which is exactly this idea of just sort of totally owned digital assistants or even physical ones. Pop Roxy is actually, again, sort of a big, sort of like a person who just supports this sort of idea that, Urbit IoT is just significantly different from what we kind of currently conceive of as being Internet of Things devices and such. It's kind of like a bit of, it's rooted in my own sort of personal interest as well, where I have a bit of a history in the previous work that I had been doing before Urbit in designing operating systems for the home. And so there's a very real desire here for this idea that a home could still be a very simple kind of manual, just very sort of like, traditional structure, something that isn't spying on you every moment of the day. But at the same time, if technology is developed such that it does respect that sort of the personhood of who you are, it isn't plugged into the great brain that represents any corporate sort of a, megalith out there. The idea is that this could be much more pleasant of an approach, I think.
Yeah, and you can also still imagine getting economies of scale and doing mass computing.
Yes.
But it would be purely voluntary. And it'd be like you and your friends or you and your neighbors. And it would be probably, I guess explicitly, it would be opt-in because that's kind of how Urbit is architected, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there are already people who I think are trying to sort of get the bearings of how maybe you could set up a weather network on Urbit for people who deploy moons to their roofs and basically funnel it all into like a sort of collectively owned, structure that represents, now I have the weather data for my friends distributed across the world or the US or whatever. It could be very interesting to see little networks of data and little kind of like, in-friend network markets that arise out of that.
Yeah, this is kind of like the long-term, insanely cool aspect of Urbit that people, I think, have a hard time even appreciating. Again, I think this is pretty far off. It's going to require a lot more engineering and development. But basically, being able to have kind of mass computational projects. So like, all of the machine learning models that Google or Apple use to provide us with amazing services. And that's the reason why we submit to this like feudalism where like we don't own anything.
Yes.
It's because they get a lot of leverage out of all that data and they're running all these machine learning models and giving back to us really cool apps, right? Mm-hmm. We're going to be able to still have those things on Urbit in the long run.
Yes.
It's just going to be like you and 1,000 of your friends are like agreed explicitly to submit your data. Mm-hmm. You have these like shared machine learning models, right? Like all of this can be done across Urbit in a totally kind of containerized private way. So you're still in a very long run, we're still going to have really badass, machine learning based tools and sophisticated mass computing techniques. Mm-hmm. It's just going to be within communities and explicit and private.
And in that way, almost better, I think, in many respects, even like in a performance sort of manner to what you are recommended or told by these systems that basically treat you as, an entry in a database.
Right.
The idea being that, if my weather network is comprised of the people that, I know and love and relate to like every day in my life, that's a truly intimate network. That's a network that actually is representative of the people using it, which is, I think, a very beautiful sort of future that we can look forward to.
Hell yeah, man. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground, and this was really interesting and fun. Is there anything going on this weekend at the conference that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, so we're going to be giving a keynote on the first day. Going to be sort of demonstrating some of the actual finessed sort of, hey, this is what software distribution is. We're going to demonstrate how to do it. It's going to be very easy, hopefully. But as things go in the Urbit world, it's iterative. We're going to make it better and better and better as we go. So that's one thing to look forward to. We're going to be seeing some great panels. We're going to be seeing some really fun other speakers going on. I'm personally excited and hoping to throw like a really fun, music night on Saturday. More news on that TBA or TBD.
Nice.
Both, I should say. But yeah, it's going to be a fun night.
Right on. Well, any parting words? Anything we didn't discuss that you want to discuss, or that's particularly interesting about Urbit? Yeah. Anything else we didn't cover?
Not in particular, but we do joke around that we're kind of like speed running sort of the development of the internet of computers as we know it. I think a lot of people like to overthink the question of what is Urbit as a project. The way that I like to introduce it to people, anyone really, technical or otherwise, is that it's just the reimagination of a computer. And whether you know what a computer is or whether you think of a computer as being the thing in your pocket or the thing that you work on, I feel like that still speaks to a truth that this isn't a crypto project. This isn't any sort of like project that I think would sort of like constitute some sort of newfangled fancy thing. It's just really simple. It is that reimagination of what a truly personal computer can be. I'd go as far as maybe joking, half jest, half real, that it may in fact be the only personal computer left, and we'll have to see.
Awesome, dude. Thanks so much for hanging out. This has been awesome.
Yes, it's been amazing.
Thanks for being our first victim. I think it was a fairly smooth process.
Yeah, this was great.
Yeah. And I'll put links to your stuff in the show notes. I'll put your Urbit handle also, and so people can find you on Urbit if they want to.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, thanks, Ed. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, that's a wrap.